If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. Winter 1944 pressed down on the northern airfields with a cold that felt engineered to stop the war itself. Snow covered every length of concrete, hardening into layers of ice that made the runways shine under the floodlights. The wind cut across the base with a steady, punishing force that made fuel slosh thickly in the drums and turned every exposed piece of metal into something dangerous to touch. The 8th Air Force had already lost aircraft that week simply because the weather decided it would. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes, 27, stood beside his B-17 Northern Star with his hands buried deep in his gloves. He had been flying since early 1943, long enough to know that luck ran out faster than steel, and seeing 3 frost-damaged bombers dragged off the runway in the past 2 days had made him think about that more than usual. His crew depended on him, but he still felt the uneasy pull in his stomach each time he imagined the engines freezing at altitude and the bombers stalling over enemy territory. He didn't show it. He couldn't. But the cold was making it harder to keep fear in its place. He glanced toward the hangars, where ground crews moved between tool carts and frozen engine stands. They looked like shadows crossing under the floodlights, bundled in layers of coats and scarves. Most of them believed the same thing. No B-17 should fly in this weather. Daniel had heard the rumors coming from them. Fuel turned into sludge, oil freezing in the lines, metal cracking during warm-up. He understood their doubt because he shared it. Still, the mission order was on his clipboard, stamped and signed. They were to join the bombing run at dawn, hit an industrial rail point near Bremen, and return before another storm front rolled in. Across the wing, Sergeant Amelia Carter, the flight engineer, tightened a panel latch while frost collected along her sleeves. She was 26, sharp-minded, and known in the squadron for fixing problems with a calm that didn't match the chaos around her. But Daniel knew her quiet wasn't a sign of ease. She was thinking through every possible failure, step by step. She had grown up in a Kansas repair shop, working with engines since she could reach a wrench, and she had enlisted because she believed technical skill could shorten the war. Tonight, though, her confidence felt strained. She checked the cowlings again, then touched one engine casing lightly, as if judging the temperature with instinct alone. Her breath shook slightly as she exhaled. She didn't acknowledge it. If these engines ice up, she thought, we won't recover in time. She tightened her gloves and moved on to the next inspection point. Inside the briefing building, Warren Blake, the co-pilot, sat alone with his elbows on the wooden table, staring at a pinned photograph of a crash site. The wreckage belonged to another B-17, one he had watched go down 3 days earlier after frost formed along the wings during ascent. The memory played in his mind like a film he couldn't stop. The bomber tilting sharply, losing lift, breaking apart before the crew could bail out. Warren kept hearing the sound it made when it struck the ground, a deep, final thud that had followed him into every night since. He was 24, a farmer's son from Wisconsin who had taken to flying as naturally as his brothers took to plowing fields. Normally, he trusted his training and his aircraft, but not this week, and not in this cold. When Daniel walked into the room, Warren straightened, but didn't hide the tension in his jaw. "You ready?" Daniel asked. Warren hesitated. "I'm not sure this weather is flyable." Daniel didn't try to argue with optimism he didn't feel. "It isn't," he said quietly. "But we've been ordered. We follow through." Warren nodded, still uneasy, but the firmness in Daniel's voice settled him slightly. Not enough to erase the fear, just enough to keep him functional. Back outside, mechanics used heated cans, makeshift burners, and cloth wraps to warm the engines. One man cursed as frost formed again along a fuel line he had just cleared. Another beat his hands together to wake feeling back into them. Everyone was pushing against a problem too big to solve fully. As the night deepened, Daniel walked the length of the Northern Star once more. Snowflakes stuck to his coat and melted slowly against the fabric. The bomber's fuselage looked heavier under the weight of ice collecting along the rivet lines. He paused at the nose glass, staring at the distorted reflection of his own face. He wasn't afraid of dying. He had made peace with that months ago, but he feared losing his crew. He feared making one bad decision that would send all of them into the ground. And he feared failing the mission when other bomber groups depended on them to hold formation. Amelia approached him, her cheeks red from the cold. "Engines should start," she said. "Should? I can't guarantee they'll stay warm long enough." Her honesty stung, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. Daniel met her eyes. "We'll take whatever time they give us." She nodded once. No dramatics, no forced confidence. Just mutual acceptance of the danger. It was enough to build trust, even in a night like this. Later, Warren joined them on the tarmac. His stride was stiff, his shoulders tense. "If the wings freeze, there won't be a second chance," he said. Daniel answered firmly. "Then we'll keep them moving. Low climb. No sharp turns." Warren swallowed hard. The logic helped. The fear stayed. At 0400 hours, the crew gathered around the bomber as the mechanics connected the heaters one final time. Amelia gave the signal, and the first engine turned over with a harsh, reluctant groan. Ice cracked along the casing. A second engine came alive, coughing before settling into a rough but steady rhythm. The third and fourth followed, each sputtering under the strain of the cold. The roar cut through the frozen airfield. Ground crews stepped back, some shaking their heads, others watching with faint disbelief. The frost around the wheels blew outward, as if the aircraft were forcing winter itself aside. Daniel stood at the base of the ladder for a final moment. The engines vibrated through the metal skin of the bomber, sounding tense and uneven. He felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on him. But he also felt the determination to see this mission through. Fear wasn't gone, but it wasn't in control anymore. He climbed into the cockpit. The mission was set. The sky, whether it accepted them or not, was waiting. The crew climbed into the bomber one by one, boots striking the metal steps with a dull weight that echoed inside the fuselage. Warm air from the engine heaters barely reached the interior, so their breath still clouded in front of them. The Northern Star vibrated under their feet as the engines continued their uneven idle, each rotation fighting the cold that pressed against every moving part. Daniel slid into the pilot's seat and pulled his straps tight, feeling the stiffness in the canvas from frost that hadn't fully thawed. Warren settled beside him, adjusting the oxygen mask hose that kept snagging against his jacket. His hands shook only slightly, control but still there. He double-checked the mixture settings and pulled the control column toward himself, testing responsiveness. Everything felt slower and heavier than usual. In the radio compartment behind them, Corporal Larson powered up the set, listening to static that shifted and crackled. He always ran checks twice, and today he would do them 3 times. The cold made the dial sluggish, and he wanted to be certain they could keep contact with base once they left the ground. Further back, the waist gunners, O'Malley and Fisher, secured their .50 calories, wiping frost off the barrels and checking the feed trays. O'Malley muttered about the cold freezing the ammunition belts, but Fisher reassured him calmly, saying he had wrapped the belts in cloth specifically to fight that problem. Small precautions mattered. Amelia reached the cockpit, carrying a toolbox under her arm. She knelt under the instrument panel, checking wiring and hydraulic lines for signs of stiffness. She had noticed a brief hesitation in Engine 3 during startup and needed confirmation that it wasn't getting worse. Her fingers worked quickly, tapping the gauge housing and adjusting a pressure line by a hair. She listened to the engines through the metal, feeling their rhythm with her palm. Daniel watched her from the corner of his eye. "Anything we need to know?" "They're holding," she said, "but the right side is colder than the rest. We'll need a longer taxi to warm it evenly." He nodded, accepting the calculation without comment. Amelia never exaggerated problems. If she said the engines would hold, they would, at least for now. The mechanic outside signaled that all external heaters were disconnected. Frost still clung to the wing edges, but not enough to delay the takeoff further. The runway lights flickered through the low fog. Visibility was worsening with every passing minute. Daniel lowered his oxygen mask. "Let's get moving." He released the brakes. The bomber began to shift, heavy and reluctant at first. then slowly rolling onto the main taxi path. Snow crunched under the wheels, and the vibration fed through the controls in constant, uneven pulses. Inside the cockpit, Warren eyed the wings. "We're carrying frost on the left. It'll burn off during roll," Daniel answered. "If the temp keeps rising inside the cowlings." "Assuming they do," Warren murmured. He didn't push the concern any further. He was already responsible for monitoring the gauges on the right side, and his concentration sharpened as he leaned in to watch for sudden drops. Behind them, Amelia strapped herself into the engineer's station, slipping on her headset. She adjusted the throttle calibrations precisely and tapped the manifold pressure readings. She tracked every movement of the needles, ready to react if any of them dipped into danger. The bomber reached the start of the runway. The tower's clearance came through with a faint crackle. They were the first plane to attempt takeoff that morning. Every other crew waited in their warm tents or stood outside, watching in silence. The entire field had been forced to pause until Northern Star decided the outcome. Daniel took a slow breath and steadied his grip. "Power up!" Warren pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, struggling at first before settling into a higher pitch. The bomber shuddered down the runway, wheels bouncing slightly on ruts of frozen snow. Frost blew from the wings in white streams as the airspeed indicator crept upward with painful reluctance. Amelia called out, "Temps rising, slow but stable. Engine 3 is improving." The numbers on the panel aligned with her tone. The bomber was fighting the cold, but it was winning inch by inch. The end of the runway approached. The airspeed was still borderline. Daniel felt a sharp spike of doubt. If it didn't lift now, braking on ice would be almost impossible. He pushed the yoke forward slightly, then back, coaxing the aircraft to respond. Warren's voice tightened. "We're barely on threshold speed." "One more second," Daniel said. The wheels hit a patch of rough ice. The bomber jolted, rattled, then slid. Warren's breath caught, thinking they were losing control, but then the vibration changed. The sliding became lighter. The weight shifted. The wheels left the ground. The Northern Star climbed, stubborn and heavy, its wings maintaining lift only because the engines refused to give in. Frost shook loose in thin sheets. Warren kept his eyes locked on the instruments, ready for any sudden stall. Amelia spoke short updates, her tone firm and steady, guiding the adjustments that kept them climbing. They pierced a low layer of cloud. The world turned gray, then white, then finally opened into clearer sky above. Daniel didn't smile, but some of the tension in his chest eased. They hadn't come up here for bravery. They were here because the mission demanded it, because the bombing of Bremen's industrial route would disrupt German reinforcements, because turning back meant failing the crews that depended on them. He leveled the wings and adjusted course. The bomber held steady. The mission had begun. The Northern Star climbed slowly, engines straining against the punishing cold as the bomber pushed higher into the morning sky. At 10,000 feet, the cockpit windows began to frost at the edges, forming thin white rings that forced Daniel and Warren to lean closer to their instruments. The oxygen gauges stabilized, but Daniel monitored them closely. The cold made every system unreliable, and he didn't want surprises as they crossed toward enemy airspace. Inside the fuselage, the crew switched fully into combat readiness. The waist gunners locked their turret mounts into place, checked ammunition feed lines once more, and clipped their oxygen hoses to the wall ports. The bombardier opened the forward equipment compartments to confirm the fusing settings. Every motion was deliberate, without unnecessary talk. They had all flown long enough to know that fear hid in small mistakes, and discipline forced it back down. Amelia remained focused at the engineer's panel, tracking the performance of each engine. She watched the temperature spikes flatten into steadier ranges, but she still eyed Engine 3 with subtle tension. It had warmed during climb out, yet it fluctuated more than the others, dropping a few degrees every time they hit rough patches of cold air. She adjusted the mixture again, carefully tuning it to maintain stability. Warren noticed her repeated corrections. "Is it holding?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the altimeter. "For now," she said, "but it's the weak point." Daniel heard the tone she used. Amelia never exaggerated problems, so if she sounded concerned, he took it seriously. "We'll keep it warm," Daniel said, adjusting their airspeed to reduce strain without losing position. They broke through the last thin layer of cloud until the horizon stretched clear, a pale, winter blue sky above a patchwork of white and gray beneath them. Other bombers from the group appeared slowly, climbing from different directions until they settled into formation. Vapor trails stretched thin behind their engines. The radio came alive with short transmissions, altitude confirmations, final course corrections, warnings about air turbulence. Larson passed the information forward in calm, clipped statements. His voice never wavered, even when static briefly swallowed entire messages. Daniel trusted him. Larson had once repaired a jammed transmitter mid-flight with a scrap of wire and a knife blade. If anyone could keep communication stable in this cold, it was him. At 15,000 feet, frost began to form inside the nose section. The bombardier wiped it away with gloved fingers, but it returned almost instantly, the cabin temperature dropping as they climbed. Ice crept along the metal joints, and the air felt sharper with each breath. "Altitude 20,000, Warren said. "Leveling soon. Maintain climb until 24, Daniel answered. "We need the space before we hit flak zones." Warren nodded. The rising tension remained visible in his shoulders. He didn't complain this time. He simply followed the procedures, showing the self-control he had forced himself to rebuild since takeoff. As they neared 23,000 feet, a sudden jolt shook the entire aircraft. The yoke vibrated, and the bomber dipped slightly. "Engine 2 just dropped power," Amelia announced instantly, her voice firm and steady. She moved her hands rapidly across the panel, adjusting throttle and mixture. "It's icing." Daniel steadied the aircraft, making sure not to overcorrect. "Recovering? Give a moment," Amelia said. The needles on her panel wavered, then edged upward again. The vibration eased. Warren exhaled slowly. "Thought we were losing it." Daniel didn't answer. He was thinking through the implications. A brief icing episode here meant it could happen again deeper into hostile territory. He increased their airspeed slightly to keep airflow strong across the wings, trusting the engines to generate enough heat to resist freezing. Below them, German territory approached. Forests, rivers, and scattered towns slid beneath the bomber's shadow. The formation tightened as they crossed the invisible border. The intercom chatter reduced to essential callouts. Then the first black burst of flak appeared far off their left wing. A moment later, more bursts dotted the air, creeping closer to the incoming formation like slow, expanding fractures in the sky. Larson relayed warnings. "Flak, 10 o'clock. Multiple batteries firing." The waist gunners positioned themselves, eyes scanning for fighters. The smell of burnt cordite from earlier tests rounds lingered faintly in the cold air. Amelia braced her hands on the panel to steady herself as another light jolt trembled through the bomber. "All engines steady," she reported. "Temperatures rising from the workload. It's good for us." Daniel kept the aircraft level, holding formation precisely. The worst thing now was to drift. Isolation attracted fighters. A closer burst rocked the fuselage, sending a metallic shudder through the cabin. Loose equipment rattled. Warren tightened his grip on the controls, but followed Daniel's lead, making small, controlled corrections. More flak erupted ahead of them, each burst leaving dark smoke that hung in the frigid air. The path to the target was forming, a corridor marked by danger, but also one they had no choice but to fly. Inside, silence held the crew together. Not fear, focus. The kind that sharpened senses and forced every distraction out of the mind. They continued forward, deeper into the incoming fire. The mission was entering its hardest stretch, and every heartbeat felt like part of the engine rhythm that kept the Northern Star in the sky. The formation advanced in a heavier fire as the Northern Star crossed deeper into enemy territory. Flak bursts thickened, pushing closer with every mile. Each explosion sent sharp vibrations through the crew's boots, rattling the frame and shaking loose frost from the inner walls. The smell of cold metal mixed with gun oil as everyone tightened their grips on their positions. Daniel kept the bomber steady, eyes fixed on the horizon. The altimeter needle wavered slightly with every shockwave, but he resisted the instinct to climb or dive. Breaking formation meant immediate exposure to fighters. Staying locked into position, no matter how dangerous, was their only shield. Left side, cluster fire incoming. Larson reported from the radio compartment, his voice clipped but controlled as he relayed signals bouncing through the static. A burst detonated just off their port wing. Warren swore under his breath as a shower of shrapnel streaked past the cockpit. A jarring clang echoed from the fuselage, metal striking metal. O'Malley called from the waist gun. "We took hits. No breach, but the skin's torn." Daniel didn't turn. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Keep eyes on fighters. The sky ahead flashed again. A series of long-range flak shells erupted at their altitude. Black clouds billowed across their path, each one a potential kill zone. Inside the bomber, every heartbeat synced with the engine's strained rhythm. A sudden, violent blast rocked them from below. The floor jumped upward. Amelia grabbed the engineer's console to stay grounded as warning lights flickered in front of her. "Starboard engine. Engine 4's fuel line is hit," she shouted. Pressure dropping fast. Daniel felt the bomber sag to the right. Warren countered immediately with trim adjustments, jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. Amelia acted without hesitation. Her hands moved across the controls with urgent precision. She shut down the damaged engine, cut fuel flow to prevent a fire, and rerouted pressure to stabilize the remaining three. "It's contained," she said, breath unsteady. "We've got enough power to stay in formation." Daniel felt the shift in control. The aircraft pulled heavier on one side, and the yoke resisted more than before. But it stayed responsive. Barely. The bombardier in the nose called out coordinates as the target zone finally appeared beneath the haze. Rail junctions, supply lines, scattered warehouses now covered in drifting smoke from earlier bombing groups. The formations ahead had already begun their runs, diving into the thickest concentration of flak. "Bomb bay doors," Daniel ordered. The bombardier toggled the switches. The doors groaned open, the freezing metal protesting the movement. They locked into place with a hard clank, instantly increasing drag. The Northern Star slowed. The formation tightened around them, maintaining spacing as flak intensified. Daniel kept the bomber level. "Steady, hold it." Another near-miss exploded, so close that the cockpit windows flashed white. Warren shielded his face instinctively as shards of ice and dust burst inward. The bomber tilted, but Daniel forced it back into position. In the nose, the bombardier leaned into his sight, adjusting for wind and turbulence. Sweat formed under his mask despite the cold. "On target," he said. "Stand by." A direct hit to their right wing cut his sentence short. A fist-sized chunk of metal tore through the rib structure near the landing light. The bomber lurched again. Fisher shouted from the rear that fuel was venting in a thin mist. "We're okay," Amelia said quickly. "Leak is small. Pressure stable." The bombardier pulled the release. The bombs fell in a clean, staggered sequence. The aircraft surged upward slightly as the weight dropped away. "Bombs away," he confirmed. Daniel turned the aircraft the moment the run was complete. The formation scattered into evasive patterns, breaking free from the direct line of flak while maintaining enough cohesion to deter fighters. As they turned, a fresh wave of fire rose from below, trailing them with frightening accuracy. The sky behind the bomber lit with alternating bursts of black and orange. Warren glanced back through the side window, as if expecting to see their tail shot off. "They're tracking us hard." "They always do," Daniel said quietly. The defensive gunners leaned into their turrets, scanning the distant haze. For several long seconds, the only sounds were the engines straining, the wind tearing past the fuselage, and the deep thumps of explosions below. Slowly, the flak thinned. The worst of the barrage fell behind them, replaced by scattered bursts that faded with each mile. "Clear of heavy batteries," Larson reported. Amelia checked her gauges again. Engines 1, 2, and 3 holding. We've lost some fuel, but we can make it back. She hesitated for a brief second before adding, the structure is damaged but intact. Daniel took a long breath. His hands were still tight on the controls, but the violent tension in his shoulders began to ease. Set course home, he said. The crew settled back into their stations, shaken but functioning. The bomber creaked from the stress it had endured. Metal fragments clinked on the floor as the fuselage cooled from the ordeal. The Northern Star turned toward friendly territory, wounded but stable, alive after a mission that should have broken it apart. Cloud cover thickened as the Northern Star left the flak fields behind, turning the sky into a pale, shifting wall that swallowed the horizon. The bomber flew lower than planned, forced down by the damaged engine and weakened structure. The air was rough and unstable. Every pocket of turbulence made the fuselage creak like strained joints under weight. Still, the aircraft held its course. Daniel kept both hands on the yoke, his gloves stiff from frozen sweat. The cockpit felt colder than before, as if the damage had allowed winter to creep deeper inside. Warren monitored the engine gauges carefully, his expression tighter than during the outbound run. His earlier doubt had transformed into something sharper, a determination not to lose control, not after everything they had survived so far. Behind them, Larson adjusted the radio frequency, fighting interference. He tapped the side panel twice, coaxing the set back into clarity. A faint transmission from base came through. Wind direction, runway conditions, visibility warnings. He relayed each detail forward, confirming they still had a landing strip and weren't returning blind. Amelia reviewed her instruments with renewed focus. The leak in the wing had slowed after she rerouted the lines, but fuel remained lower than ideal. She calculated the remaining distance with strict precision, accounting for wind resistance and reduced power. The numbers aligned, barely but enough. "We have enough fuel to reach home," she said. "No margin for detours." Daniel nodded. "We'll keep straight." Warren adjusted the trim again, compensating for the right side drag. The controls resisted him, forcing pressure into his arms. He steadied his breathing, maintaining smooth corrections. In the fuselage, O'Malley and Fisher inspected the torn section of the wing root through a small viewing slit. They could see faint mist trailing back, a reminder of how close the hit had been to destroying the fuel tank entirely. The damage looked worse from inside, a long tear in the rib that had bent part of the internal frame. "Looks like it's hanging on by stubbornness alone," O'Malley muttered. "It'll hold," Fisher replied, not because he felt certain, but because the crew needed that confidence. Minutes stretched into a slow, tense climb towards safety. When they finally crossed back into friendly airspace, Amelia confirmed the engine temperatures had stabilized. The worst of the cold was behind them. The bomber was still wounded, but the risk of structural failure decreased with every mile. Larson picked up a clearer signal from base. "They have us on radar. We're cleared for direct approach." Daniel lowered their altitude gradually, watching the cloud layer dissolve into rolling white fields and wooded patches. The airfield appeared in the distance, snow-covered, quiet, with ground crews already positioned near the runway edges. "Gear check," Warren said. Amelia verified the hydraulics, pressing her hand against the panel for stability. "Pressure low, but functional. It should deploy." "Should," Warren muttered under his breath. "It'll deploy," she said more firmly. Daniel aligned them with the runway glide path. The bomber descended with a slow, heavy glide, the damaged wing pulling slightly despite constant trim corrections. At 200 feet, the landing gear extended with a reluctant groan. One wheel locked in late, slamming into place for a second that made Amelia's heart stop, but it held. "Gear down and locked," she confirmed. Daniel kept the nose steady. The engines hummed with uneven rhythm, pushing the bomber toward the ground in a controlled fall. The wheels touched down hard. "I sent the aircraft sliding." Warren pumped the brakes in measured bursts. The tail skidded sideways, corrected, skidded again. For a moment, the bomber felt as though it would spin out, but the friction caught at the last second. The Northern Star straightened and rolled forward until it finally came to a slow, shaking stop. Silence overtook the interior. Heavy, exhausted silence broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. Daniel removed his mask. His breath trembled with the release of pressure he had held since takeoff. Warren leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands, overwhelmed but relieved. Amelia exhaled so deeply it sounded like she had been holding air for hours. Ground crews rushed toward the bomber. Tools clattered, ladders went up, and voices cut through the cold morning air. Mechanics inspected the damaged wing, stunned at how the aircraft had stayed airborne. Daniel climbed down first, boots hitting the icy ground. The cold felt different now. Not a threat, just weather. Warren followed, eyes scanning the torn wing with disbelief at how close they had come to losing it. Amelia stepped out next, her arms crossed tightly against the wind, but her expression carried a quiet sense of victory. An officer approached them, stopping short when he saw the damage. "You brought her home," he said, unable to hide his amazement. Daniel gave a small nod. No celebration, no dramatic words, just acknowledgement. Warren looked back at the bomber again, his earlier fear replaced with steady respect. "She held together," he said, almost to himself. "She did," Amelia replied, "because we did everything we could to keep her alive." The crew gathered near the nose, watching as the mechanics swarmed the aircraft. The Northern Star looked battered, punctured skin, burned edges, and frost still clinging under the wings. But it stood firm, a survivor of a mission that should have broken it apart. They walked together toward the mess hall. The warmth inside washed over them instantly, thawing frozen fingers and faces. They sat at a long wooden table, eating quietly. No retelling of the worst moments. No boasting. Just a shared understanding that they had crossed something rare, a line between expectation and endurance. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the snow-covered runway. The damaged B-17 remained parked where it had stopped, steam rising from its engines, mechanics working around it with renewed purpose. The mission was complete. The aircraft had returned, and every member of the crew was alive. It was the ending they had hoped for, hard-earned, real, and whole.